influential book I've ever read on Islam.
He talks all about democracy.
Yeah.
And everyone, and that's what I've been saying. Everybody looks at me like I'm nuts, everybody should be an equal citizen, get rid of the Gaza and get rid of this and. You want some water?
Oh, sure. Thank you.
Water, quarter of a glass. Would be good. Thank you. Thank you for doing this. Yeah. Did you bring a towel?
I need to see for some towel. There must be something in the restroom. Yeah, it's over here or something.
Hello, everyone. Hi, Rabbi.
Hi. Hi, Nancy.
Hello?
Sometime we're gonna be able to see that.
Oh, yeah, let me get that up now.
Recording in progress.
Sorry, hold on, that'll go in a second.
Can I run out for one? Would Becky Zoe be still here?
I don't know if Becky's still here.
I still haven't figured out how you get into CRC, what's it called?
Oh, there's just a thing you click.
No, I mean, there's
Wi-Fi?
the thing you sign up on.
Yeah, there's just,
I
there's
think
just,
you need a password.
no, you don't.
Oh, no.
It gives you a password. You click the thing and it gives you a password.
Yeah, the Genesis group's going to have,
Oh, so
some things.
Welcome. Yeah.
Is there a way to get into this meeting without having to sign in every week?
Do you not get an email with a reminder?
I get a reminder, but that's not the problem. I don't have a URL. I have to go through the website and then I sign in as Samantha's shaking her head as a new member.
Toby,
I
so
have to go through,
what
I
do
have to
you-
go through it, and I tried, getting it, and there is none. I think they may want us to do it for security reasons.
There's not a they here. It's a me, and it's a setting that I must have set funny.
so Toby, what you'll need to do is just go back to that original email that is probably the one that you got today. And if that same link that it provides you, you can use every week.
Okay,
So you can
I'll give that a
every
try. I'm
calendar.
used to just going zip and that's it. Cause I
I
live
know.
on it.
I know, Toby, for what it's
Okay.
worth, I have to do that sometimes too, and then it tells me that it won't give me the link because I'm the host. So then I just give them a fake email address and then it lets me in, which I'm not sure that's security, but there you go.
Okay, I'll figure it out. Thank you.
Let's try it.
Sometimes they have gotten, not they, but CRC has gotten very security conscious for good reason.
Just do that. Okay.
I'll give it just another minute for people to join, and Harriet ran out to go let someone in, so I'll give her a minute too. While we're waiting for that, plug for tomorrow, which is in person only, 5 o'clock at CRC, the first of what we're calling Beit Midrash, study house, study hall. But for the next month, it will be spiritual preparation for the High Holy Days. So join us tomorrow.
Will that, and that'll be weekly?
That'll be weekly.
Because I'm still in New Jersey right now, but by next Wednesday, I will be in St. Louis again.
Welcome back. Welcome back. We'll be glad to have you.
I am signed up, by the way, I don't know if this might be of interest to anybody else, for a St. Louis Jewish History bike ride on September the 22nd, which is starting, I think, at the History Museum Library on Skinker, which I know is formerly a synagogue, although I don't remember which one now.
United Hebrew.
I feel like 2/3 of the buildings on there are
Yeah.
formerly synagogues. Yep.
Yes, yeah. So it's I think a 2-hour ride on, I think it's a Sunday, the 22nd.
Good for you.
Nice. Bike ride of Jewish St. Louis. Yeah. Larry, if you get us the sign up information, we can pass that around too. So that'd be great. Thank you. Okay, let's jump in.
I'm coming to you, Rachel.
So I want to back us up to last week and give you a sense where we're going this week and next week. We are solidly into a period. Well, actually, you know what? We're going to start with a little timeline here, an actual timeline. Where's my share screen? Okay, here you go. Is this coming through okay? Ignore my notes. That's not what we're looking at, just the timeline here. Actually, let's see. Okay. So yeah, we'll talk about all this in a second. One of the themes that we've come back to again and again is the difference between the mythological story of the Jews that you may have learned in Sunday school or an Intro to Judaism class, or that we think of as sort of being the standard contemporary Orthodox view of Jewish history and of the Jewish timeline. Again and again, our theme is that itself is a creation of this moment right now and is a modern myth. That you go back in time 1,000 years ago, the same version of what the Jewish story is entirely different or significantly different. And all of those things are different from what our best tools of history suggest as well. That made sense what I just said? Yeah? Any confusion? So what we are looking at here is a contemporary traditional mythological timeline of Jewish history. I'm going to say that again. This is a contemporary, meaning from our moment right now. Traditional, meaning this is sort of the Orthodox rabbi approved mythological timeline, because it's the story we tell ourselves rather than actual history of Jewish history. Did that make sense?
Yeah.
As much as any of this makes sense. Yep. Okay. So this is how contemporary Orthodoxy understands Jewish history. From 200 BCE to the year 0, I like how here it's calling it negative 200. That's actually pretty helpful. Is a period known as the Zugot. This is Zugot meaning pairs. Zug is a couple, like a dating couple. You're a Zug. So Zugot meaning pairs. And when we look at this time period, at least in the mythological version of it, we could also think of this as the period of the Pharisees. But you have all of these pairs who go together. Shmuel and Rava are a pair, but maybe the most famous of these is Hillel and Shammai. These pairs. That's different than the period of the Tanaim. Now we're at 0 to the year 200. These are the people who both write the Mishnah and show up in the Mishnah. These are the rabbis of the Mishnah. And that's a word we've used over and over again, Tanaim, excuse me. Then we have the period of the Amoraim. Amora, it's that ayin there, and it's said in the back of your throat, just like the resh is said, right? The English R is said with your tongue bent in the middle of the mouth, but the Hebrew resh is a guttural. In fact, if you want to say it at the right place, say chet, or baruch, or chaver, in the same place in your mouth that you were saying a cha, say a ra, and that's a resh. It's not quite the rolled R that you find in other places in the Mediterranean. It's resh. So similarly, the ayin is a guttural stop from that spot. So the geonim is the same word as the Gemara. They're also known as in Hebrew as the Amoraim. So you'll hear that. Excuse me, I said Geonim. I said Amoraim here. We're at the 200 to 500 or so. Amoraim, but it's that same sound. The other word that is maybe most famous, particularly these days, is Aza, which is Gaza.
Oh.
Right, and what's happened is that the guttural Hebrew is turned into a G, a G sound of a G, because that's one of the few letters that we say in English that is pronounced in that spot. G, Gaza, Gaza. I can't really do it, but yeah.
I've heard them say
Gaza.
Gaza sometimes.
It's not a cha, it's a Gaza, Gaza. Yeah, I can't really say it. But that's what we're having here. So the Amoraim are the rabbis of the Gemara, and that's of course where we get Gemara from. Amara, right? You hear the same word there, and it's both those guttural sounds. The Savoraim are the editors of the Gemara. The Gaonim, we've talked about the Gaons, the geniuses. These are the heads of those Talmudic academies in Babylon. So this is essentially the Babylonian Talmudic era. Then we get a period, which is where we are right now, of the Rishonim. You'll notice we even have the red line showing that's where we are right now. Not right now as in we don't live there, but right now in the story of us. The Rishonim, meaning the first ones, and the Achronim, meaning the later ones. These are the periods post-Talmudic Academy, not just Talmudic writings, but post-Talmudic Academy. So the Rishonim are people like Rashi and Maimonides and Nachmanides and all of these folks essentially until the expulsion from Spain. That's really the demarcation here. And then you get a period known as the Achronim, and that's the period we are in now, otherwise known as modernity. Okay, does this make sense? Is this
Does that mean after?
Achar? Yeah. Rishon means first, and Acharei means
Later.
later. Yeah. Exactly. Okay, just pause for a moment about that setup, making sure that that made sense to people. Any thoughts, any notes? Okay, so last week, this week, next week, we're going to be dealing with the period of the Rishonim. In particular, we're looking at the end of the Rishonim. We've traced the Jews primarily of Sfarad, of Spain, of the Iberian Peninsula. It's really where we focused. And when we've talked about the Jews of the Ashkenaz, we've talked about them as Hoosiers. And I mean that in the St. Louis sense of that word, right? These are backwards people. These are rednecks. These are whatever sort of dismissive words you want to have for them. That's how they were viewed by the rest of Jewish society, who lived in the cultured centers of the Muslim world. Like a lot of this is just the political reality that Jews in the Muslim world weren't living at a subsistence level, whereas often the Jews in the Christian world not only were living at a subsistence level, but were being tossed back and forth so that there really was very little permanence that was happening. Make sense? So we are jumping back to the Ashkenaz, back to the world of the Ashkenaz today. And then next week, we will jump back to the world of Sephardi refugees, particularly those who end up in the north of Israel and become the Kabbalists, Isaac Luria and those sorts of folks. But today we are focusing on the Jews of the Ashkenaz, which is to say the Jews of the Christian world. All on the same page? Any thoughts? Any? Okay. So last week, when we talked about the end of Spanish Jewry, of Iberian Jewry, and we really can talk about it that way because there is essentially no Jewish community in the Iberian Peninsula today. Small community, there's a couple little sites, but by and large, unlike many places, even in Christian Europe, though not in Poland, where we are going to focus today, there are contemporary Jewish communities. If you go to the Iberian Peninsula, who here has spent time in Spain, Portugal? Any of us? If you've gone to visit Jewish sites, you've gone to see Jewish historical sites. not sites of contemporary Jewry by and large. But you go to Germany today, you can visit certainly Holocaust memorials and destroyed Jewish sites, but you can also go and visit vibrant Jewish communities that don't get along with each other, just like Jews everywhere else don't get along with each other. Primarily Russian speaking in Germany today. But that's different in Spain. So last week we tried to, and hopefully this came through, we tried to place the expulsion of Jews from Spain not as an exception to the rule of Jews in the Christian world, but actually as the norm. I have these dates that I gave last week, but let's just do them again quickly. In 1290, England expels all of its Jews. In 1394, France does. In 1421, Vienna does. In 1424, Linz and Colonia do. 1439, Augsburg. 1442, Bavaria. 1485, Perugia. I don't know where that is. 1486, Vicenza. In 1488, Parma. In 1489, Milan and Lucca. In 1493, Sicily. 1494, Florence. 1498 from Provence. So when we examine the expulsion of Jews in Spain in the light of that context, even as it was the center of the Jewish world, so it was the most traumatic, it is really Spain's way of joining Europe. In so much as Europe means, and I think actually it does mean this, the Christian land, as opposed to Africa, which means the Muslim land at that time period. And actually we're talking North Africa, so still pretty true today. That becomes the racial divide, the religious divide, the racial divide. The imagined racial divide emerges out of that religious divide. Spain joining Europe, joining Christian society, meant kicking out their Jews. And that's how we contextualize this. And in fact, we looked at some of the laws and the lead up to it and examined it in light of the Holocaust, with the ultimate goal of seeing the Holocaust itself not as exceptional, but as the logical and predictable continuation of the better part of a century of anti-Jewish expulsions, ethnic cleansings, genocides, and policies. Right, we even looked last week about how in Spain it starts with restrictions on where Jews can live, and then restrictions on what occupations Jews can have, and then restrictions on what schools Jews can go to, and then kicked out of certain areas, and on and on and on in laws that sound right straight out of the Nuremberg laws or something. Which is to say that the Nuremberg laws come straight out of this tradition, which is just a very different way of looking at the Holocaust than we have traditionally learned. And of course, when we get to the post-Holocaust era in the story of us, we will talk about the reasons why the Holocaust has been taught this way mythologically. Did that make sense, that line that I just said? Okay.
In some ways to make it useful the way it's explained.
Yeah, every story we change to make it useful to us. And there's different, we'll look at how Israel talks about the Holocaust and how America talks about the Holocaust. And but there are reasons why for a long time we wanted to teach the Holocaust as exceptional. Anyways, we'll get there.
It's really much more interesting as a phenomenon if
Yeah,
you
yeah.
look at it historically.
If you see it as a part of this broader phenomenon of Christian Europe, absolutely. So that's what we covered last week. I want to bring us all the way back to a couple months ago when we looked at the genetic origins of Ashkenazi Jews. Some of us were there, some of us weren't. If you missed that, for sure, go back and check out that session class of Story of Us. It was super fascinating. But the short version of it is this. We think of Ashkenazi Jewry as being a distinct racial ethnic group. And it is in some ways, right? You can take a 23andMe test and spit into a thing, and it will tell you if you are Ashkenazi. It shows up as a group like this. It's remarkably inbred, is the other way of saying
Does
it.
Sephardic show up in the same way?
Not nearly the same way. There's much less of a distinct Sephardi genome. There's some ways of seeing it, but much less. For Sephardi Jews, the connection to the Middle East shows up in their genome. To the Levant shows up in their genome, similar to Ashkenazi Jews, but there's not a distinct Sephardi genome. Part of that is that the Sephardi world is much more spread out. But we'll get next week is on Sephardi Jews. Yeah, hold that thought. But the big takeaways from the Ashkenazi genome idea is that even as today, it is a distinct inbred endogamous community, meaning intermarried, right? Every Ashkenazi Jew, something like genetically a third cousin to each other. True story. People with stomach problems, right? Raise your hand. But I like how some of us actually raised our hands there. That was very, but that was not true originally. 1,000 years ago, the Jews of the Ashkenaz, the Jews of the Christian world, are a remarkably diverse genetic makeup. You have Jews who have fled the Muslim world. You have Jews who have fled much more recently from Israel, from whomever is controlling it at various points. You have Jews who are Jews by choice, who have converted. You have Jews who have been in the Ashkenaz for a while. You have, it's a really diverse group of people who all get locked into a community where they're not allowed to marry out, and by and large, they're not allowed to convert out. And so it creates the Ashkenazi genome, but it was not something that pre-existed. So we are again talking about a Jewish community with significantly greater ethnic and genetic diversity in the Ashkenaz during the period of the Rishonim, 1000 to 1500 or something, than it is during the period of the Achronim in which we live today. Thoughts, questions? I just want to make sure we're on the same page as we share this background before we move forward. Okay. Has anyone heard of the paradise of the Jews? Is that a phrase that means anything to anyone? You may have heard the contemporary equivalent or the 100-year-ago equivalent, the Goldene Medina.
Mhm.
The Goldene Medina was America, the Golden Land, the Golden State. But I'm going to butcher the Latin, Paradiso Yehudem or something kind of like that. I apologize if we have any Latin scholars. The paradise of the Jews. For the better part of 500 years, from around the year 1000 to 1500, that describes Poland. Poland was the paradise of the Jews. There were laws in the year 1000 that gave Jews autonomy to rule over our own communities within Poland. We have laws in the 1200s in Poland making accusations of blood libel punishable by death. Accusations of blood libel punishable by death. Anti-Semitism, wasn't the word they would have used, is illegal in Poland. We see, in fact, to accuse a Jew of having murdered a Christian child in 1400s Poland required 3 Christian witnesses and 3 Jewish witnesses. Kind of wild, right? Certainly not the Poland that we think of. So because of this incredible tolerance, Jews began to flock to Poland. Now we're talking about a different place than the contemporary boundaries of Poland. This is an area that at various times included Poland and Lithuania and Latvia and Estonia and parts of Ukraine and all sorts of chunks, sometimes pieces of what later becomes the Hungarian, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, because all of these broader, greater Poland. So that by the time you get to call it 1550 or so, I tend to think this is an exaggeration, but there are some scholars who think that 2/3 of all of the Jews in the entire world lived in Poland. I've seen numbers as high as 3/4. Sorry, I'm just closing this door.
My roots go there somewhere.
So we can even see the ways that the Ashkenazi genome is created through the experience in Poland. And really, maybe the way we should describe the Ashkenazi genome is Jews whose family members at some point ended up in Poland as a refuge from the other places of Christian Europe. You get a lot of folks fleeing from what later becomes Germany to Poland throughout this time period. You get a lot of folks fleeing from the Iberian Peninsula who end up there. You get people who just leave the Ottoman Empire to head there because it's said to be so tolerant. So if you have ancestry that is Ashkenazi, you should know that that means you have ancestry that's also Sephardi.
Okay.
Right, in terms of genetics and ancestry and those sorts of pieces. The way we divide the Jewish world today between Ashkenazi and Sephardi is really cultural more than anything, as well as the last 500 years of endogamy in the Ashkenazi world. And it's cultural in the sense that Sephardi Jews come from Muslim places and Ashkenazi Jews come from Christian places. That's basically the idea there. So if 2/3 of the Jews end up in Poland, in this paradise of the Jews. Oh, the other one, the dismissive title that the Holy Roman Emperor had for the king of Poland, this is around 1100, is that he was king of the serfs, the nobles, and the Jews. One of the names, if you're going to take one name from this time period, is the Rema. Has anyone heard that acronym? Just like Rashi is an acronym, right? The Rema is Rabbi Moshe Isserles. It's kind of hard to talk about him without talking about Yosef Karo, who we're going to cover next week. But Rabbi Moshe Isserles is also sometimes called the Maimonides of Poland. There's that.
How do you spell that last name?
Isserles. Oh, you should never ask me to spell anything. Isserles. I think that should be close enough for Google. Yeah.
Never heard of them.
And next week you said is.
Yosef Karo.
Sounds like Joseph Caro, the writer, though.
Yeah, just
Yeah.
the same name.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Moshe Isserles, known as the Maimonides of Poland. I mentioned before the saying that is often said about Maimonides, from Moshe to Moshe, there is none like Moshe. This is also on Moshe Isserles's grave. But they're talking about Maimonides to Isserles. There's none like either of them in Isserles's grave. In fact, Isserles's grave, the Rema's grave, was an important site of Jewish pilgrimage, yearly pilgrimage, particularly on Lag BaOmer every year, until the Nazi destruction. That really ended that and maybe destroyed his grave. I'm not totally sure of that. So Isserles, I'm not going to talk about his main work. We'll talk about that next week. But what Isserles did was create the yeshiva system as we know it today. When you go back, and we talked about this, 2,000 years ago, but when you go back to the early rabbis and they talk about the yeshivot, study centers, rabbinic training centers, we're really talking about a few people showing up in someone's home. Today, a yeshiva is an academy. Yeah, an academy in which you study at a yeshiva is Talmud. And that's because of Moshe Isserles. He comes, no surprise, from a very wealthy family, so he doesn't have to work. So he is able to create these Talmudic academies and pass on that idea. Yeah, and pass on this idea. And that becomes the distinctive contribution of this era of Polish Jewry, is the study of Talmud as a religious act. You're living at the year 900, studying the Talmud as a religious act in and of itself, like you would study Tanakh, Hebrew Bible, is absurd because, your grandparents helped to write it. It's not holy. That's, you know, what we were just working on last week. By the time you get to Moshe Isserlis, which is, you know, 1500s, then you get the ability for it to be old enough to become sacred. Again, one of these themes we've seen again and again in the story of us, where antiquity and authenticity become the same thing. So this is Isserlis's great contribution. It's also Polish Jewry's great contribution, is the study of Talmud and the academies of Talmudic study as the primary Jewish activity. This is still true in the Orthodox and the ultra-Orthodox world. The Hasidic movement, which we're going to get to in a few weeks, is a rejection of this, is a pushback against the intellectual elitism of this sort of setup. But this is the world of Polish Jewry. And in fact, if you know people who are really Talmudists, they're sometimes called Litvaks. Lithuania and Poland are often a part of the same kingdom during this time period. And Litvaks meaning they're really into the Talmud, as opposed to into the heart of the matter, the kavanah, the intentionality behind it. Okay, makes sense? So now let's talk about why Jews end up in Poland. Some of it is obvious. If it's the only place that'll take us, that's where we flee to. And with all the political upheavals in Europe, right? I just gave that list of all the places we were kicked out of and when. Makes sense that we would end up in Poland. So what was in it for the Poles? We've actually talked about this as an example to help us understand earlier historical moments in Jewish history.
Financial development.
Financial development. Poland itself was operating in a feudal system, continued in a feudal system for a very long time. And the feudal system depends on two classes of people, the nobility and the serfs. Where serfs are tied to the land, they cannot leave. It is a permanent status. And the nobility are the ones who own and control the land. So there's one category that exists outside of that feudal system, and that is the church. So the church is always a place where you can go and escape the process of being a serf. And there's all sorts of interesting histories and analyses of, you know, quite famously, as we all know, you are not allowed to get married and have children when you are a priest or a nun. This was a compromise that the nobility enforced on the church as a check on its power.
Oh, isn't that interesting?
Right? It's a compromise that the nobility forced on the church as a check on its power. This is really similar to the system in the Torah. Go to the Torah and look at the descriptions of the various tribes. Right? All of the tribes have their region that they own, to the point that these are forever owned by that tribe. Right? Every 50 years at the Jubilee, there's supposed to be a great shofar that sounds, and it's a reboot, and all of the ancestral tribal lands go back to their tribes, even if they've been sold off over the various years. But there is one tribe that has no allotment of land. The Levites, the Kohens, the priests. And once again, this is there as a check on their power. The other tribes enforce this because otherwise the priests would have this ritual, powerful economic role in every location, as well as having their own power sources of land. Similarly, the church enforces this rule of marriage and children against, the nobility tries to enforce this against the church. Does that make sense? Not that it stopped all sorts of popes from having children and calling their children the next pope and all these sorts of things, right? The powerful never have to follow the rules. Some things don't change. But regardless, this is what's happening. So we're going to do a Marxist analysis of anti-Semitism here. And if you look at Poland, 2/3 of the Jews in the world, in the year 1500 or so. The nobility has brought in the Jews because it is a check on the power of the church. Right? The serfs have to be loyal to the nobles, but the church controls their eternal souls. So there's this constant power struggle between the nobility and the church, including in land ownership and taxes and in every way you can think of. There's this constant power struggle. But there is one group that the church holds no sway over, and those are Jews. So the nobility pushes for Jews to be welcome in Poland. It's also worth noting, it seems pretty clear that many of the Polish nobility genuinely have a highly tolerant streak to them that just doesn't appear in other places. There really seems to be something going on in the water there with these people in terms of genuine, 1,000-year-old versions of pluralism. But the power struggle with the church means it is in the church's interest to push anti-Semitism. And it is in the nobility's interest to fight anti-Semitism. So we started this session when we were talking about the Polish laws that protected Jews, in 1200, having a law that said a blood libel is punishable by death and requires 3 Jews and 3 Christians as witnesses. We can understand that as a protection for Jews and as a good-hearted pushback against anti-Semitism. But the more cynical Marxist view of this is that actually that is a rule that is pushing back on the power of the church, which itself is pushing anti-Semitism in order to check the power of the nobility, neither of which has much to do with Jews at all. Did that make sense? While we're pausing here, speaking of having nothing to do with Jews, I want to give a plug for my favorite book on anti-Semitism, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition, by Nierenberg, I think it is. If someone wants to Google it and drop it into the chat, Anti-Judaism, the Western Tradition. And what I love about this book is it is an examination of what we would today call anti-Semitism, that isn't at all about Jews. It looks at anti-Semitism as a phenomenon of non-Jews that is only vaguely connected to actual Jews, which makes sense, right? Anti-Black racism is a phenomenon of white supremacy. Similar kind of approach done to anti-Judaism. Yeah, Samantha writes, it is long, but a very good book. Absolutely. You can skim some of the earlier chapters in particular. When I teach at Eden Seminary, when I teach to Christian seminarians, this is pretty universally my required book, almost whatever topic I am teaching, except the Star Trek classes. It is not required for the Star Trek classes.
Author's name?
Nierenberg, I think. Yeah, Nierenberg, Nirenberg. And despite that name, I don't believe he is Jewish. Okay, so did that make sense how we just set up both the tolerance of Jews in Poland as well as the reasons for anti-Semitism? Yeah. So it's a slow and gradual process that happens here, where Jews flee from places where we are not welcome, whether we're talking about Spain or the various other places in Europe, and end up in Poland, where the nobility has realized it is good for their bottom line. Jews end up being quite loyal to the nobility in Poland for obvious reasons. We also form essentially an artisan and a middle class within a society that was still feudal, and cause an enormous boom to the Polish economy. Okay, I just want to pause for questions for a few minutes. Yeah, John.
Are there restrictions on what they could work in business? What kinds of areas? Did they do trading or?
So Jews primarily come into these regions as traders. That's how we enter, and that ends up being an important part of our role in the economy. But by and large, we are middle class folk. whereas most people living in these places are serfs who are tied to the land,
Mhm.
or nobles who are also in some ways tied to the land. Jews are separate from that. You can also see the origins of some of the anti-Semitic ideas. Jews are globalists. They're cosmopolitan, right? They live in cities, unlike the real Poles who live on the land, who work the land, who are in touch, right? And this is only a hop, skip, and a jump away from German-style blood and soil, or some of us might say Charlottesville style blood and soil, right? Of course, they were chanting this as well in Charlottesville. So yes, but there tend not to be restrictions on Jews, and Jews have self-governance. There's starting in the 1500s, there are chief rabbis of Poland, whose job it is both to set Jewish law normatively for these communities and to negotiate with the nobility. But when we talk about setting Jewish law, we're not talking about what is kosher, what is not kosher, praying 3 times a day. I mean, some of that too, but we're talking about being the Supreme Court for Jews. You know, if one Jew kills another Jew, if one Jew steals from someone else, if there's a property dispute, if there's a land argument, if there's a marriage and divorce and records and all of these pieces,
No.
Jews were allowed to self-determine within Poland. John.
Did then the Crusades, most of the Crusades, bypass Poland?
Yep. The Crusades don't go through Poland. We can even look at a map here for a second that we can see it. Screen share. Here we go. So you can see that in order to get to the Middle East, you're not by and large going to go through Poland when you're going from Christian Europe. So Poland offers a refuge from all of these things and is also, the Crusades become a driving force for Jewish relocation to Poland.
Yes, but also during about the 1400s in the area that in Germany, it's of course that's a different area at that time. The number of crusades that were sent out to wipe out different Jewish communities just in that area was just horrific.
Yeah. The Crusades were as much a series of pogroms against Jewish communities as they were a war on Islam. It's not really a war on Islam, right? These are political wars with theological, not even justifications, but propaganda to sell it to common folk.
So this didn't really spread into Poland that much.
No, Poland and Polish nobility took advantage of it. Right? This was a great opportunity for them, and that's how they got Jews to move there. It increased the power of the nobility. It powered their economy. It was an incredibly helpful move for them. Yeah. Other hands, other questions? Nothing? This was so straightforward? Okay. So next week we are going to move into the Jews of, in particular, the refugees from Spain who end up in the Muslim world, including in the Levant, whether we're talking about Ottoman Palestine or the north of Israel, or all of these words are both political and have different meanings than we assign to them today. And so we'll use a various set of words. But we are going to move into the era of the codes. Maimonides is the first producer of these codes with the Mishnah Torah, which we talked about and which we're going to start studying on Tuesdays when we are done with Story of Us. But the goal with this was to take the Gaonic period, which was dependent on a few brilliant individuals who knew the Talmud back to front and could issue Jewish rulings based on it, move from the Gaonic period to a way that local communities could figure out what Jewish practice looked like. So Maimonides takes the Talmud and turns it into the Mishnah Torah, a guide for Jewish living in all sorts of different categories. Right, it ranges from what to do when you find something valuable, to how to keep kosher, to the ways that prayers work, to how you can tell when someone is a Messiah.
Good to have a way.
Good to have a way, right? But it was big for Maimonides. Actually, another note, speaking of which, and this won't surprise any of us as we've talked about it, is that this is a time period when you get a number of different Jewish messianic movements, people who pop up claiming to be the Messiah. And we're going to talk about some of the particulars. But for those of us who have been doing Story of Us for a while, that should come as no surprise. That when there is destruction, when there is displacement, you are going to get mysticism and messianism and afterlife theologies, etc., etc.
Since the Messiah was a worldly king, shouldn't there be a series of messiahs rather than a messiah?
So you can get some series of messiahs. The notion of a messiah is also in flux and is constantly being developed. The last time we really talked about messianism in a Jewish way was figures like Jesus, right, which are entirely a political notion. By the time you get to Maimonides, which is post-Islam and post-Messianic Christianity, you have a very different idea of a Messiah, and it becomes much closer to a spiritual Messiah, to an eschatological Messiah, if you remember that word, the division of history into inherent time periods, before the flood, after the flood, until Abraham, after Abraham, until the Exodus, after Exodus, until Jesus, after Jesus, so and so, after Jesus comes back, etc., etc. So lost my train of thought here. Messiah. Oh, so we have a differently developed notion of the Messiah by this point. One of the things I love, just to go on a little bit of a tangent, about Maimonides' idea of Mashiach is that it's very clear that Mashiach, Messiah, isn't something that anyone realistically could ever achieve. It's also not something that seems impossible for someone to achieve. And I think there's a value here, and it is so Maimonides as well. And he probably thought of it this way. My guess is he didn't actually believe in the notion of a divine Messiah, but also thought that the Messiah as a figure was important to people. If you didn't have that,
Something to strive for.
something to strive for. And so the way I've always understood it with Maimonides is that he sees the danger in the Messiah being too distant. If you don't have any hope that the future can be different, that leads to terrible things. And there's a danger if the Messiah is too close and you believe you can achieve it right now. That also leads to really terrible things. So he has this whole interplay that sets it just far enough away. Of note, other than the building of the temple, the rebuilding of the temple, I believe David Ben-Gurion meets every single requirement of the Messiah for Maimonides. Which, again, is why, and we'll get there when we get to contemporary Israeli history, which is why after 1967 and what's known as the Six-Day War, it's when Israel begins to occupy the West Bank, but also when Israel gains control of the old city of Jerusalem and the sacred sites there, that was the birth of religious Zionism as a potent political force in Israel instead of weirdo fringy people. And you can see why. All of a sudden, we were just a step away from Mashiach. If you want a book on this, which is fascinating, Yossi Klein Halevi's Like Dreamers traces how this happens. Do not go buy this book. We have 50,
Oh,
okay.
50 copies here at CRC. Sometimes when people come, I just give them out and I say, why don't you take a second one? Just in case. It's a big, heavy book. That way you can have one that holds up the other one while you read it. So yeah, if you'd like a copy of that, just sometime when you're at CRC, find me, and we would happily free up closet and storage space from Yossi Klein Halevi's books. So this is Maimonides' notion of Messiah. That was all a tangent from the idea of codes, right, that cover everything, the summary of the Talmud. Next week, we're going to look at Joseph Caro, who writes a update companion of the Mishneh Torah. It becomes the standard Jewish halachic document known as the Shulchan Aruch, the set table. You may have heard of the Shulchan Aruch. Moshe Isserlis, the Rema, who we talked about today, is the Maimonides of Poland. He writes a gloss on the Shulchan Aruch, meaning a book that's a commentary on the book, that updates the law for Jews living in the Christian world, for living in the Ashkenaz, as opposed to Yosef Karo, who is living in the Muslim world. So that's where we get these sort of two different traditions of Jewish law you can really point to emerging from this moment. In fact, in some ways, you can say that the birth of Ashkenazi Jewry and of Sephardi Jewry as distinct Jewish manifestations, to the point where today, if you show up at an Orthodox shul, you can pull down a Siddur of either of these communities. It really emerges from this moment and from these two figures. Okay, that is all of our content for today. So questions, thoughts?
Yeah, I've got a thought. The fact that Maimonides came up with these two different sets of what the Moshiach meant. Okay, I've tried to is kind of interesting from the same person who does the guide for the perplexed, and I mean, it's the emergence of both of those.
Yes, the Guide for the Perplexed and the Mishneh Torah are so different from each other that there have been academics for hundreds of years who have proposed that perhaps they weren't written by the same person. That is no longer the case. Almost no one suggests that anymore. There were all sorts of attempts to reconcile it. Which one did he really believe or not believe? When you really dig into the Mishneh Torah itself, as we will, it is as revolutionary as the guide. It's just written differently. For instance, the beginning of the Mishneh Torah starts with the beginning of creation, but not Genesis, not Torah. It begins with it in the same way that Aristotle begins with it. It's a first mover that Maimonides talks about, and ends up proving Judaism down the line from that. But that is such a radical, heretical approach that just has been missed by folks for so long, right? Maimonides starts his guide to Jewish life through natural law, not divine law.
Sounds
Wild.
like Spinoza.
Yeah. Spinoza understood what Maimonides really meant. Steve.
Hi, unfortunately, my question is from about 20 minutes ago when I put it in the chat instead of raising my hand.
Oh, I'm sorry, I missed that.
That's okay. So my question is, when they got to Poland and they were invited in, how did they ever get people to give them the land and the stuff to build it? And then I have a new question, which is, when did they start putting restrictions on their coming and going into these villages they built?
Yeah. So, there's lots of small answers to this, but the big one is the nobility owns all of the land in a feudal system. So the nobility could grant land to the Jews, but the first Jews end up in Poland as traders, not as merchants, not as farmers. And, the amount of land that traders and merchants need is tiny, and they live in cities. They don't live out in the countryside. They're not taking up valuable
So
farmland.
they had rentals.
They have rentals, or even if it's
Yeah.
granted to them, and then you end up with Jewish towns and Jewish neighborhoods that are granted by the king to these Jewish communities as they begin to emerge. In terms of restrictions, you actually see starting in the 1400s more and more power within the church that forces some of these nobles to restrict Jews. By the end of the 1400s, you see some places where Jews have been kicked out of, particularly areas in Lithuania, less so in Poland proper. But then actually things start looking back up for Jews just at the end of the 1400s as Jews are fleeing from Spain. And again, we can think of this as a lovely coincidence, or we can look at this in sort of a Machiavellian, cynical way, a Marxist way, and say that, you know, the nobility saw this opportunity and the laws were crafted to take advantage of that opportunity.
Open the doors, we'll do well with them.
Yeah, open the doors, we'll do well with it. Good, good.
Were there any restrictions on intermarriage?
I don't know the answer to that. You don't get a lot of intermarriage. It's just not a phenomenon that happens during this time period by and large. When it does happen, it tends to be through conversion, or conversion as sort of a prerequisite of it. Again, Jews are a welcomed separate entity that are being demonized, literally, actually, by the church. And so you can see that that would cause huge issues. It also pits the serfs against the Jews. So there's some notable examples of Jews and particularly daughters of the nobility sometimes forming relationships and marrying, but they're exceptions and almost always exceptional during this time period.
Okay, thank you.
Not that it's not happening, you know, Romeo and Juliet style all the time. Also, that always happens everywhere. But Loomsteins, I'm not sure which of you has your hand up, but no. Oh, I thought I saw a hand up there. Okay, any other thoughts? Any other questions before we call it a wrap? Okay. See everyone next week. Good to be with everyone.